John pulled his beat-up moving truck into the driveway of 42 Sycamore Lane and killed the engine, breathing in the unfamiliar calm. Shady Oaks seemed like a nice place to start over. The subdivision was all neatly manicured lawns, freshly painted shutters, and not a piece of litter in sight. It was like something out of a catalog. As John climbed out of the cab and stretched his stiff legs, he noticed a woman in a crisp polo shirt and checkies striding purposefully up the sidewalk, a leather-bound notebook tucked under her arm. She had the air of someone used to getting her way. "You must be the new owner," she called out, her voice carrying across the quiet street. "I'm Karen, the president of the Shady Oaks Homeowners Association. Welcome to the neighborhood." She thrust out a hand and John shook it, noting her firm, almost crushing grip. "John Johnson," he introduced himself. "Nice to meet you." Karen's smile didn't quite reach her eyes as she gave John a once-over, taking in his ratty jeans and sweat-stained T-shirt. "I trust you received a copy of our HOA bylaws and covenants, conditions, and restrictions with your closing documents." John scratched his head. He vaguely remembered signing a thick stack of papers, but he'd been more focused on the interest rates and closing costs. "I think so," he hedged. Karen pursed her lips. "Well, I highly recommend you familiarize yourself with them. We have very specific standards here in Shady Oaks." She flipped open her notebook and clicked her pen with a sense of finality. For example, all move-ins must be completed between the hours of 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. to minimize disturbance to the neighbors. Trash cans are to be stored out of sight except on designated collection days, and lawns must be mowed to a height of precisely 2.5 inches, with edges trimmed weekly. John's head was starting to spin. 2.5 inches, he repeated. "Isn't that a little extreme?" Karen fixed him with a cold stare. "Extreme? No, Mr. Johnson. What's extreme is letting our standards slip. What's extreme is allowing chaos and individuality to run rampant. Shady Oaks is a bastion of order and conformity, and it's my job to keep it that way." She snapped her notebook shut and smiled thinly. "I'll leave you to your unpacking, but don't forget your lawn will need to be up to code by Monday. And please do try to keep the noise down." With that, she spun on her heel and marched off, leaving John gaping in her wake. He looked around at the uniform houses, the identical lawns, and felt a prickle of unease. What had he gotten himself into? Shaking off the feeling, John popped open the moving truck's rear door and surveyed his meager possessions. His ratty sofa would look out of place amid all this suburban perfection, but it was a start. As he began hauling boxes, he couldn't shake Karen's parting words. Lawn up to code by Monday. He'd be lucky to find his lawnmower by then. And what was all that about individuality and conformity? John had a sinking suspicion that life in Shady Oaks wasn't going to be quite the fresh start he'd hoped for, but he was determined to make the best of it. After all, how bad could one pushy HOA president really be? Oh, if only he knew what he was in for. The housewarming party was in full swing. John had finally gotten the last of the boxes unpacked and thought it was time to get to know his new neighbors. He'd sent out invitations, bought a few cases of beer, and fired up the grill. As the sun began to set, the cul-de-sac filled with the sounds of laughter and clinking bottles. John was just starting to feel like he might fit in here after all when a sharp voice cut through the chatter. "What's going on here?" The crowd parted to reveal Karen, the HOA president, marching up John's driveway, her face pinched with disapproval. She had a piece of paper clutched in her fist. John set down his burger flipper and stepped forward, trying to keep his friendly smile in place. "Hey, Karen, just having a little get-together. Want a hot dog?" But Karen wasn't here for pleasantries. She thrust the paper at John's chest. "Do you know what this is?" John took the paper and scanned it, his heart sinking. "Notice of violation," he read aloud. "That's right," Karen snapped. "Trash cans visible from the street. That's a $50 fine." John looked over to where his trash cans were neatly lined up at the curb. "But it's collection day tomorrow," he protested. The bylaws say trash cans may be placed on the curb no earlier than 6 p.m. the day prior to collection, and must be removed by 8 p.m. on collection day. Karen interrupted, her voice rising. It's 5:58 p.m. You're in violation. John couldn't believe what he was hearing. It was a 2-minute difference, and the cans weren't even on the curb. They were in his driveway. Look, Karen, he tried to reason, don't you think that's a little extreme? It's just a couple of minutes. But Karen was unmoved. Rules are rules, Mr. Johnson. And speaking of rules, she cast a disapproving eye over the gathered neighbors, who were starting to shift uncomfortably. Gatherings of more than 12 individuals require prior FOA approval. I don't recall seeing a party request form from you. John could feel his face heating up. This was ridiculous. It's a housewarming party, he said through gritted teeth. I'm just trying to meet my neighbors. Well, you're off to a poor start, Karen replied coolly. First the trash cans, now an unauthorized assembly. That's 2 violations in one day. She made a show of jotting something down in her ever-present notebook, then fixed John with a hard stare. I'll be keeping a close eye on you, Mr. Johnson. I suggest you familiarize yourself with those bylaws. Quickly. With that, she spun on her heel and stalked off, leaving John holding the violation notice and a rapidly cooling spatula. Around him, the party mood had evaporated, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. As his guests began to drift away with mumbled excuses, John crumpled the notice in his fist. $50 for a 2-minute trash can infraction. Unauthorized assembly. This was beyond petty. This was harassment. He looked around at his new home, suddenly feeling very unwelcome. Karen's parting threat echoed in his ears. She'd be watching him, waiting for him to slip up. Well, 2 could play at that game. If Karen wanted a fight, she'd gotten one. John wasn't about to let some power-hungry busybody dictate his every move. He was going to live his life, HOA be damned. But as he began to clean up the abandoned party debris, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just made a powerful enemy. And in Shady Oaks, that was a dangerous thing indeed. Over the next few weeks, John felt like he was living in a police state. Every time he stepped outside, he could feel Karen's eyes on him, watching for the slightest infraction. He got a notice for leaving his garage door open for more than an hour, another for parking his car on the street overnight, a third for having a non-conforming welcome mat. It was like living under a microscope, every tiny detail of his life scrutinized and found wanting. The fines were piling up too, $50 here, $100 there. John was starting to wonder if he'd have to take out a second mortgage just to keep up with Karen's petty sanctions. But it wasn't just the financial burden that was wearing on him. It was the constant stress, the feeling that he couldn't relax in his own home. He'd started to dread coming home from work, knowing that there would likely be another violation notice waiting for him. He tried to fight back, writing carefully worded emails to the HOA board questioning the legitimacy of the fines. But his protests fell on deaf ears. Karen, it seemed, had the board wrapped around her little finger. John was at his wits' end, but just when he thought things couldn't get any worse, they did. He was out mowing his lawn, to precisely 2.5 inches, of course, when he heard a commotion from next door. Old Mrs. Henriksen, who had lived in Shady Oaks longer than anyone, was standing on her porch, tears streaming down her face as she argued with a stone-faced Karen. John shut off his mower and hurried over, catching the tail end of the conversation. Can't do this, Mrs. Henriksen was saying, her voice shaking. I've lived here for 40 years. This is my home. Karen looked unmoved. I'm sorry, Mrs. Henriksen, but the rules are very clear. Decorative lawn ornaments are limited to 1 gnome or flamingo per yard. You have, she consulted her notebook, 7 gnomes and 3 flamingos. That's a violation of the Shady Oaks Beautification Code, Section 12, Paragraph 4. But they were gifts from my grandchildren. Mrs. Henriksen protested. Karen snapped her notebook shut. You have 24 hours to remove the excess ornaments, or the HOA will do it for you and bill you for the removal, plus a $500 fine for non-compliance. With that, she turned on her heel and marched away, leaving a sobbing Mrs. Henriksen in her wake. John felt a surge of anger. This wasn't just about him anymore. Karen's reign of terror was affecting everyone in Shady Oaks. Someone had to stand up to her. He helped the shaking Mrs. Henriksen back into her house, promising to help her move her beloved gnomes and flamingos to her backyard, out of Karen's line of fire. But as he worked, he couldn't stop thinking about the heartbroken look on the old woman's face. This was more than just a power trip. This was cruelty, plain and simple, and it had to stop. As he hefted the last concrete gnome over the fence, John made a decision. He was done playing defense. It was time to take the fight to Karen. He didn't know how yet, but one thing was for certain. The Wicked Witch of Shady Oaks had picked the wrong homeowner to mess with. John was going to bring her down, one way or another, even if it meant breaking every rule in the book to do it. John had thought he'd seen the depths of Karen's pettiness. He was wrong. He came home from work one evening to find a tow truck in his driveway, his beloved '68 Mustang hooked up to the winch, and there, supervising the whole operation with a smug smile, was Karen. "What the hell is going on here?" John demanded, leaping out of his commuter car before it had even come to a full stop. Karen waved a piece of paper at him. "Inoperable vehicles are strictly prohibited in Shady Oaks," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "This eyesore hasn't moved in weeks. It's a clear violation." "It's not inoperable," John shouted. "It's a classic car. I've been restoring it." But Karen wasn't listening. She nodded to the tow truck driver, who started winching the Mustang up onto the flatbed. John ran to the truck, ready to physically block it, but Karen stepped in his way. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," she said softly. "Interfering with an official HOA action is a serious offense. You wouldn't want to make things worse for yourself, would you?" John clenched his fists, his whole body shaking with rage. This wasn't just a petty fine or a warning letter. This was his property, his pride and joy, and Karen was taking it away just because she could. He watched helplessly as the tow truck drove away, his Mustang bouncing on the back. Karen stood on the sidewalk, watching him with a victorious smirk. "Have a nice evening, Mr. Johnson," she said, and sauntered off. John stood in his empty driveway, anger and humiliation coursing through him. This was too far. This was personal. He stalked into his house, slamming the door behind him so hard that the windows rattled. He paced his living room, his mind racing. He had to do something. He had to stop Karen. But what could he do against the full might of the HOA? As he paced, his eyes fell on the thick HOA rulebook sitting on his coffee table. The sight of it filled him with loathing. That book was the source of all his problems. It was Karen's Bible, her weapon of choice. And suddenly, he knew what he had to do. He grabbed the rulebook and sat down, flipping it open to the first page. If Karen was going to use the rules against him, then he was going to use them against her. He read through the night, skipping dinner and ignoring the growing pile of violation notices slipped under his door. He read every word, every subclause, every footnote. And as he read, a plan began to form. It was risky. It was audacious. It might even be illegal, but it was the only way to beat Karen at her own game. He was going to have to out-HOA the HOA. By the time the sun rose, John's eyes were bloodshot and his head was pounding. But he had a plan, and more importantly, he had hope. Karen thought she was untouchable. She thought she could push the residents of Shady Oaks around forever. She was about to learn just how wrong she was. John closed the rule book with a snap. It was time to turn the tables on the tyrant of Sycamore Lane. The revolution was about to begin, and John would be leading the charge. John spent the next few days holed up in his house, poring over the HOA bylaws with a fine-toothed comb. He was looking for a loophole, a technicality, anything he could use against Karen. And then he found it. Buried deep in the dense legalese was a clause about HOA board elections. It stated that any rule changes had to be approved by a majority vote of the homeowners. Moreover, if a petition signed by at least 20% of the homeowners called for it, a special election could be held to recall the board. John sat back, a slow smile spreading across his face. This was it. This was his weapon. He started quietly, talking to his neighbors one by one. He listened to their stories, their grievances against Karen and the HOA, and he told them about the recall petition. At first, many were hesitant. They'd lived under Karen's thumb for so long, they couldn't imagine standing up to her. But as John talked, he could see a spark of hope kindling in their eyes. Mrs. Henriksen was the first to sign. With a shaking hand, she scrawled her name at the top of the petition. "For my gnomes," she said, a steely glint in her eye. Others followed. The young couple who'd been fined for painting their door the wrong shade of white. The retired veteran who'd been forced to take down his American flag. The single mom who'd been threatened with eviction over a missed dues payment. One by one, they signed, and as the list of names grew, so did their courage. John kept meticulous records, gathering evidence of every violation, every fine, every abuse of power. He built a case, brick by brick, against Karen and her cronies. And then, when he had enough signatures, he made his move. He marched into the next HOA board meeting, the petition clutched in his hand. Karen was presiding, her gavel at the ready, a bored look on her face. "Madam President," John said, his voice ringing out clear and strong. "Under Section 12, Paragraph 7 of the Shady Oaks bylaws, I hereby present this petition, signed by over 20% of the homeowners, calling for a recall election of the HOA board." The room erupted into chaos. Karen's gavel banged frantically, trying to restore order, but it was too late. The other homeowners were on their feet, shouting their support, waving their own copies of the petition. In the midst of the pandemonium, John caught Karen's eye. For the first time, he saw something other than smug superiority on her face. He saw fear. The recall election was set for 2 weeks later. John threw himself into the campaign, rallying his neighbors, exposing Karen's misdeeds at every opportunity. Karen fought back with all the power at her disposal, sending out threatening letters, levying spurious fines, even sicsing the police on John for imaginary infractions. But it was no use. The tide had turned. The people of Shady Oaks had awoken from their long nightmare, and they were hungry for change. On election day, the votes were counted. It was a landslide. Karen and her entire board were swept out of office. John, to his surprise, found himself elected as the new HOA president. As he stood at the podium, looking out over the sea of cheering faces, John felt a sense of pride and purpose he'd never known before. He'd set out to take down a tyrant, but he'd ended up doing so much more. He'd given his neighbors back their homes, their dignity, their lives. The fight wasn't over. There would be more battles to come, more Karens to face. But for now, in this moment, they had won. Shady Oaks was free, and John was just getting started. The recall election sent shockwaves through Shady Oaks. For the first time in years, the residents felt a glimmer of hope, a chance at a new beginning. But Karen wasn't going down without a fight. In the days following her ouster, she began a campaign of intimidation and sabotage. Anonymous letters filled with vague threats appeared in mailboxes. Cars were keyed in the night. Garbage cans were overturned, spilling their contents across driveways. John knew it was Karen, trying to undermine the new HOA leadership. But he couldn't prove it. She was too clever, too practiced at covering her tracks. He refused to stoop to her level. Instead, he focused on undoing the damage she'd wrought. He disbanded the hated lawn inspection committee, tore up the stack of pending fines, and sent out a new set of bylaws, ones that prioritized community over conformity. Some of the old guard grumbled, but most of the residents embraced the changes with relief and gratitude. For the first time in as long as anyone could remember, Shady Oaks felt like a neighborhood instead of a prison camp. But Karen wasn't finished. At the next HOA meeting, she showed up with a team of high-priced lawyers, threatening to sue the board for defamation, discrimination, even embezzlement. John was ready for her. He'd spent hours poring over the HOA's financial records, and what he'd found was shocking. For years, Karen had been siphoning off dues money into a private slush fund, using it to pay for her own lavish lifestyle. Spa days, fancy dinners, even a new sports car. He laid out the evidence, spreadsheet by damning spreadsheet. The homeowners were outraged. Even Karen's staunchest allies began to distance themselves, not wanting to be tainted by association. In desperation, Karen played her last card. She called the police, claiming that John had threatened her, that she feared for her safety. But when the officers arrived, they found a very different scene. Dozens of homeowners came forward, each with their own story of harassment, intimidation, and abuse at Karen's hands. The police took one look at the mountain of evidence and knew this was no simple neighborhood dispute. As the officers led Karen away in handcuffs, John felt a sense of grim satisfaction. Justice, at last. But the fight wasn't over yet. Karen's lawsuit still loomed. A ticking time bomb that could bankrupt the HOA and undo all their hard-won progress. John spent sleepless nights preparing their defense, gathering witnesses, combing through legal precedents. He knew they were in the right, but would that be enough against Karen's high-powered legal team? The day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was packed. Karen sat at the defendant's table, smirking confidently. Her lawyers looked like sharks in expensive suits. But as John laid out his case, point by methodical point, he could see the tide turning. The judge's frown deepened with each piece of evidence, each testimony of abuse. And then came the final blow. John called a surprise witness, Karen's former right-hand woman, who had agreed to testify in exchange for immunity. She took the stand and, in a trembling voice, began to unravel the web of lies, manipulation, and outright fraud that Karen had spun over the years. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as she detailed secret bank accounts, forged signatures, even hush money payments to keep dissenters quiet. When she finished, you could have heard a pin drop. Karen's face had gone ashen. Her lawyers looked like they'd swallowed lemons. The judge didn't even deliberate. In a blistering verdict, he found in favor of the HOA on all counts. Karen's lawsuit was not only dismissed, but she was ordered to pay restitution to the homeowners she cheated over the years. It was over. They had won. As John walked out of the courthouse, blinking in the sunlight, he was mobbed by his neighbors, all wanting to shake his hand, to thank him for what he'd done. But John knew the truth. It wasn't just him. It was all of them, standing together, that had made this victory possible. Shady Oaks had a long road ahead, a lot of healing to do. But as John looked around at the smiling faces, the tears of joy, he knew they were ready for it. A new day had dawned in Shady Oaks, and this time they would face it together. The annual HOA meeting was just a week away, and tensions were running high. It was the first meeting since Karen's arrest, and everyone knew it would be a pivotal moment for the future of Shady Oaks. John had been working tirelessly to prepare. He drafted a new set of bylaws, ones that prioritized fairness, transparency, and community. He'd reached out to every homeowner, listening to their concerns, their hopes, their ideas for making Shady Oaks a better place to live. But he knew Karen wouldn't go quietly. Even from jail, she was still trying to pull the strings, using her remaining loyalists to sabotage John's efforts. The night before the meeting, John was up late, going over his notes, when there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find Mrs. Henriksen, a grim look on her face. "They're planning something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I overheard them talking. They're going to try to invalidate the recall election, say it was rigged." John's heart sank. He'd been expecting something like this, but he'd hoped they wouldn't stoop so low. He thanked Mrs. Henriksen and spent the rest of the night on the phone, rallying his supporters, preparing for battle. The next evening, the community center was packed. It seemed every homeowner in Shady Oaks had turned out, sensing the importance of the moment. John took his place at the front of the room, took a deep breath, and called the meeting to order. Immediately, one of Karen's cronies stood up, waving a sheaf of papers. "I have evidence that the recall election was fraudulent," he shouted. "Illegal votes were cast. The results must be overturned." The room erupted into chaos. People shouted, argued, shook their fists. John pounded the gavel, trying to restore order. And then, from the back of the room, a voice rang out. "I have evidence, too." Every head turned. There, standing in the doorway, was Karen's former secretary, the one who testified against her in court. She marched to the front of the room and handed John a thick folder. "These are emails, text messages and recorded phone calls proving that Karen and her accomplices conspired to rig the original HOA election that put her in power, she said, her voice shaking but clear. They intimidated voters, bribed board members, even hacked the electronic voting machines. The room went deathly silent. John opened the folder with trembling hands and began to read. The evidence was damning. Copies of checks, transcripts of incriminating conversations, even a video of Karen herself stuffing a ballot box. John looked up at the stunned faces of his neighbors. "It's clear now," he said, his voice ringing with conviction, "that Karen's reign was built on a foundation of lies and corruption. The recall election wasn't just legitimate, it was necessary. It was the only way to restore integrity to our community." One by one, people began to stand, to applaud, to cheer. The holdouts, faced with incontrovertible proof of Karen's misdeeds, quietly slipped out the back. In the end, the vote was unanimous. The new bylaws were adopted, a new board was elected, and a new era began for Shady Oaks. As the meeting adjourned, John found himself surrounded by his neighbors, all wanting to shake his hand, to hug him, to thank him. Mrs. Henriksen, tears in her eyes, pressed a small, wrapped box into his hands. "A little welcoming present," she said with a wink, "for your garden." John unwrapped it to find a small, cheeky garden gnome, its red hat cocked at a jaunty angle. He laughed, feeling the weight of the last few months lifting off his shoulders. It was a new day in Shady Oaks, and he couldn't wait to see what it would bring. 1 year later, Shady Oaks was a transformed place. Under John's leadership, the HOA had become a true community organization. Meetings were open, transparent, and collaborative. Decisions were made by consensus, not by fiat, and the focus was on enhancing the neighborhood, not enforcing arbitrary rules. The change was visible everywhere you looked. Lawns were lush and green, but with a healthy diversity of plants and landscaping styles. Houses sported a rainbow of colors, each reflecting the unique personality of its occupants, and the streets were filled with the sounds of laughter, of neighborly chatter, of kids playing without fear. Even Mrs. Henriksen's garden gnomes had made a triumphant return, now joined by a colorful menagerie of flamingos, windmills, and gazing balls. The sight never failed to make John smile. There were still challenges, of course. Old habits die hard, and some residents struggled to let go of the rigid conformity of the Karen era. But they were a dwindling minority, their grumbles drowned out by the overwhelming spirit of community that had taken root. As for Karen, she'd become a cautionary tale, a boogeyman invoked by parents to scare their unruly children. "Be good," they'd say, "or Karen will come and make you mow your lawn." John had visited her once in prison, more out of curiosity than anything else. She'd been a shadow of her former self, her power suit replaced by an orange jumpsuit, her imperious sneer by a hunted look. "I was only trying to keep order," she'd said, her voice a raspy whisper, "to keep property values up. I did what I had to do." John had left without responding, feeling not anger, but pity. Karen had been a prisoner long before she'd ever seen the inside of a cell, trapped by her own need for control, for power. In a way, the HOA had been her prison too. But those days were gone. Shady Oaks had been liberated, and it was never going back. On a warm summer evening, John sat on his front porch, sipping a beer and surveying his domain. His lawn was a riot of wildflowers, a buzzing, fluttering oasis that drew compliments from all who passed. And there, in a place of pride, was his '68 Mustang, lovingly restored to its former glory. It had been the first thing he'd done after the trial, a symbol of his own personal liberation. As he watched the sun set over the rooftops, John reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here. He'd come to Shady Oaks looking for a fresh start, a place to call home. He'd never imagined he'd find a calling, a crusade. But he had, and in fighting for his home, he'd found something even more precious, a sense of belonging, of purpose. He'd found a community. The sound of laughter drew his attention, and he looked over to see a group of neighborhood kids playing an impromptu game of soccer in the street. Their parents stood nearby, chatting and cheering them on. John smiled. This was what it was all about, This was why he fought so hard, not for power, not for control, but for this, for the simple, profound joy of living among friends. He raised his beer in a silent toast, to Shady Oaks, to his neighbors, to the crazy, wonderful, maddening miracle of community, and to the future, bright and full of promise, stretching out before them like an open road. He couldn't wait to see where it would lead.